Barry Humphries continues reading from his new autobiography, My Life as Me. Melbourne sees Barry growing up into a dissolute artist and offers him models for the future Edna Everage.
At Norman Robb's bookshop in Little Collins Street, I bought, by installments, art books, from which I first learnt of the antics of the Dadaists. Immediately my life changed, and I decided then and there to become a Dadaist. At Melbourne University, I became Dr. Aaron Azimuth, Dadaist. Azimuth, in his public appearance, resembled a mad doctor from the German expressionist cinema. He was like the eponymous hero of my favorite film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. He wore a long black coat and a black Homburg, emphasizing a deathly white makeup and mascaraed eyes. He recited his poems and tirades in a loud staccato voice and extolled madness and violence as the ultimate virtues. Of course, I was not always able to look like Aaron Azimuth. For much of the time, I was obliged to resemble any other timid 19-year-old art student. Tweed sports coat, crew-neck jumper, viola shirt, and grey slacks. But I was an aspiring fancy pants, a suburban dandy. I contrived to achieve variations on this traditional uniform. I sported a red paisley bow tie, the only one in the faculty, and tied by me, no common made-up clip-on. Sometimes I wore a yellow jumper with a bright overcheck, for it was important to make an impression, a slight stir. My hair was longer than everyone else's, though certainly not by today's standards. Can't you tell the barber to give you a proper haircut, Barry? The lectures passed like a dream, so boring. Nothing as stimulating as the inner, angry life of Dadaism, my life as Aaron Azimuth, my Mr. Hyde. It was a secret life of subversive jokes, of adult baiting, gratuitous acts, quixotic and inexpedient. The first big Dadaist exhibition of 1952, in my first year at university, established my notoriety, with its provocative sculptures of perishable materials, such as cake and offal, juxtaposed with undergraduate blasphemy and the odd insult to the royal family. At the Puckapunyal military camp that I had attended, I found a discarded portrait in oils of King George VI by an artist of moderate competence. The medals the king wore were particularly well executed, and I merely had to paint the word Dada meticulously on one of them, sign the picture myself, and put the picture in an elaborate frame for the work to be mine. It may come as a surprise to hear that this was the exhibit that gave the greatest offense. In second year, I was up for election to the Student Representative Council, and my public address as a likely candidate was the opportunity for a Dadaist demonstration in the university's largest lecture theatre. Before a packed audience of students, our little group of Johns, we all seemed to possess the first name John, even me, wearing cretin masks, stood somewhat bravely performing our absurd acts of provocation. John Levi presided over an electric toaster, in which the toast, to the intense frustration of the audience, was allowed to burn without intervention, filling the large lecture theatre with smoke. John Watson, a friend and Dada conscript, merely poured water from one large vessel into another and back again. John Perry wrote the word poem in huge letters on a blackboard with his right hand while erasing it with his left, so that the word never completely took form. I displayed a large painting of cows in a landscape by the 19th century Australian artist Sheltimer, which I bought for comparatively little, though today it would be worth at least $20,000. Announcing that I intended to publicly execute a painting, I produced an axe and proceeded to hack this large gold-framed picture to pieces until our audience was in a state of uproar. After 2 years at university, spent mostly in Dadaist pursuits and theatrical diversions, I dropped out. My parents were at their wits' end. All my friends seemed set on their vocational paths, but I, once so full of promise, seemed already to be burnt out and adrift. In order not to bring total disgrace upon the family, I numbly accepted a job that my father had wangled for me in the wholesale record department at EMI, but I continued to appear in student plays and reviews by night. Ultimately, these led to my first professional theatrical engagements, and my decision to become a full-time actor. I had disappointed my parents with my academic failure, and I had acquired a dubious circle of new friends, moving in raffish artistic circles, where drink and nicotine exerted their perfidious influence. Once, when my parents were away for several days, I decided to throw a party in the family home for my new acquaintances. It seemed a pity that no party had ever been held there in living memory, and several of the larger rooms, especially the new and extended sunroom, which opened through French windows onto a back terrace, were perfect for entertainment. Surely, if I distributed enough ashtrays and got rid of all the empty bottles, there would still be a couple of days before my parents' return. By that time, I would have opened all 45 windows and allowed Melbourne's sweet and respectable zephyrs to flush out the miasmic residue of my clandestine soiree. On the appointed night, and to my alarm, a lot more people turned up than I had expected. It seemed that the habitués of the saloon bar of the Swanston Family Hotel had all thought that they were invited, even when they were not. Moreover, they assumed that this tacit invitation included their friends. Never had such a heterogeneous collection of artists, models, alcoholic journalists, small-time actors, suburban potters, hangers-on, gate-crashers, and barflies descended upon the quiet decorum of Christowell Street. Lights flicked on in neighbors' houses and curtains twitched. Soon every light downstairs in our house was blazing, and the radiogram, long accustomed to Ravel and Delius, was blasting forth at full volume that tiresome new musical novelty, rock and roll. During the course of an interminable evening, the telephone rang several times with complaints from sleepless neighbors, as I tried in vain to turn the music down and at the same time prevent intoxicated strangers from wandering upstairs. At length, between 4 and 5 a.m., the liquor ran out, and my guests noisily departed. No sooner had they gone than I began attacking the Augean stables that had once been my mother's spotless home. It was as well that I had begun the cleaning-up process before passing out, for at 8:30 a.m. there was a telephone call from Geelong announcing that my parents were returning earlier than expected and would be home within the hour. I worked furiously, vacuuming every corner, washing plates and glasses, and moving furniture to conceal cigarette burns in the carpet. As I lugged the last sackful of empty bottles and stashed it in the boot of my mother's baby Austin, which I was then permitted to drive, I caught a glimpse of Mr. and Mrs. Tootell, our next-door neighbors, standing on their front lawn, staring at me through the shrubbery. Their expression was far worse than disapproval. It was disappointment. That phrase of my mother's, oft repeated, came back to me as I locked away the clinking evidence. It's hard to believe, Barry, that you used to be such a nice boy. Although I had been far from sober during the evening, I was sober now, as, chewing a breath freshener, I tried to assume an air of nonchalance when the large grey Buick, carrying my parents, purred up the driveway. My father, preoccupied as usual with business, seemed not to notice anything. My mother looked at the vacuum cleaner and the open windows and then at me. But "I see you've been taking care of the house, Barry," was her only tart comment. "Would you like a cup of tea?" I asked. But at that moment, my parents' attention was elsewhere. They were looking fixedly up the staircase with expressions on their faces I did not recognize. Ambling down the carpeted steps, wearing nothing but one of my father's best Van Heusen shirts, was Pauline, a notorious figure in Melbourne's artistic circles, once model, now dipsomaniac. Despite her hair lip, Pauline had been pretty long ago, or was said to have been. Now she was at Toulouse-Lautrec. She was La Goulou. Her disheveled hair, the color of hay, was caught up in an unruly topknot, and her rouged cheeks looked as though her face had been the target of a beetroot-throwing contest. The shirt had been rendered shorter by the projection of her large breasts, exposing as she tottered unsteadily from the penumbra of the landing a dark delta of pubic curls. She had passed out, as I later discovered, in my parents' bed, and I had never thought to check the upper rooms of the house when I had been so busily exorcising the party downstairs. My mother and father were speechless as Pauline, clinging to the banister and with a certain stateliness that sometimes invests the permanently drunk, croaked, "Barry, darling, is there still a cold one in the fridge?" The apparition of Pauline and the night of riot that it betrayed were blows to my parents from which they never quite recovered. Incrementally, their disappointment in me grew. I'd fallen in with an older crowd, and a bad lot they were. To some extent, although I never revealed this, I agreed with my parents' assessment, and I hoped I'd never see Pauline again, but this other life had its dangerous and heady allure, and I knew that something very terrible and very frightening lay in store for me. The life of an artist. The first time Mrs. Edna Everage appeared on the stage was in 1955 in a light-hearted revue called Return Fare. She was a simpering, painfully shy housewife, offering accommodation in her lovely home to the foreign athletes who would soon be coming to Melbourne for the 1956 Olympic Games. Mrs. Everage spent most of the sketch extolling her interior decorations and seemed only willing to billet an athlete if he or she was white, clean, and spoke English. Edna was also reluctant to cater to exotic culinary demands. I had once heard a similar Melbourne lady making a fuss in one of the city's better continental restaurants. Having summoned the head waiter, she rose from her chair and pointed to the innocuous ravioli on her plate. "Is it asking too much?" she shrilled, while her husband cowered in the chair beside her, trying to look invisible. "Is it asking too much in this restaurant to get a nice plate of good, clean Australian food?" The angular, censorious, and somewhat prissy Edna of lower-middle-class Mooney Ponds might not recognize the grandiloquent and imperious dame who recently appeared on stage at Buckingham Palace and introduced the Queen herself, in her own words, as the Jubilee Girl. The two Ednas are separated miraculously by nearly half a century.
Barry Humphries was reading from his autobiography, My Life as Me. The producer is Ned Shire, and part 4 can be heard at the same time tomorrow.
AC Radio 4 FM. Now, our book of the week. Memories of the 1960s almost escape Barry Humphries, although the decade saw his rise to fame, a private eye cartoon, and stage success, and far too much to drink. Barry Humphries continues reading from his autobiography, My Life as Me.
say that if you can remember the 60s, you were not a part of the 60s. If this be so, then I would certainly qualify as an eager participant. For in the closing years of the psychedelic decade, the gaps widened, the episodes of amnesia multiplied. Yet my denial was robust, although I remained an acute observer of other people's decline. On some mornings in the late 60s, when the BBC provided me with a taxi to take me across town to Shepherd's Bush to work, for I was still employable in an institution which then offered an almost benevolent sanctuary for the drunk, I would ask the cab driver to take me first to the Red Lion in Waverton Street, Mayfair, only a few blocks from the house where I maintained an impoverished bed-sitting room. At the Red Lion, I would consume a quick, matitudinal glass of Fernet Branca, my preferred digestive of that period. Unpunctual in all other matters, I always managed to get to the pub at precisely the moment when it opened its doors, and I no longer needed to tell the barmaid what I wanted, for she would have spotted me already, and the vile black medicine, as much a punishment as a cure, would already be standing before me on the bar. I had acquired a new theatrical agent with an office in a fine Regency house in Mayfair. The building was owned by an extraordinarily rich manager of a successful rock group, and he had extended his empire to include theater, film, and television. The impresario himself was a prodigious drinker, and for all I knew, a lover of other elating substances. An atmosphere of madness pervaded the building. Despite this, it continued to make large sums of money, and the rock group that funded the whole enterprise is famous to this day. Every evening after finishing work on my short-lived BBC series, The Barry Humphries Scandals, I would travel in a black taxi to my Mayfair slum, then visit my agent at the cocktail hour. In that office, the cocktail hour extended from 11 in the morning until 11 in the evening, and all drinks, however exotic, were freely available. I marvel at the fact that I survived the many hours spent visiting this hospitable office. By then, my own alcohol consumption had passed the danger point. But like all alcoholics, I thought of booze as something rich and worth pursuing. The results were always catastrophic. Yet I kept on drinking just the same, because I believed that if I persisted, I would one day get it right. Somewhere out there, I knew there was that unthinkable alternative, abstinence. But in those years, at the end of the 60s, I could not conceive of having the urge to drink and not drink. If I'd not decided to abjure alcohol at the beginning of the 70s, I would certainly have predeceased most of my old drinking companions in Soho. But the journalist and the sedentary boulevardier, Geoffrey Bernard, must have made some terrible Faustian pact, because he survived to a miraculous age, although, as my Australian car salesman friend would say, not in showroom condition. On my rare excursions back to Soho, Geoffrey's once handsome face, which now resembled in colour and texture a diseased lung, would loom out at me piteously from some corner of the Groucho Club. By then he'd lost a leg, but it was as if he were hacking off his appendages, even gouging out his organs to fling at the implacable gods. Here he seemed to be saying, "Take my limbs, my liver, even my heart, but please let me still have just the one." I first glimpsed the brilliant comedian, writer, and impresario Peter Cook in the saloon bar of the Lamb and Flag off Floral Street, Covent Garden, in 1960. The cast of Lionel Bart's Oliver, of which I was one, drank there between matinees and evening shows. All those of us who drank did. Occasionally, some of the players in the concurrent hit, topical satire Beyond the Fringe at the Fortune Theatre, dropped into the pub as well. Peter Cook, who sometimes accompanied Dudney Moore for an abstemious half-pint, was aquiline to the point of undulation. Although he never diffused an aura of vanity, He held his fine features at a haughty tilt, as though regarding himself dispassionately in an invisible looking-glass. By then his celebrity was well established, and he wore a dark suit of shiny mohair in a modish cut. I did not see Peter again until the following year. I had done my first successful Australian one-man show, A Nice Night's Entertainment. I'd returned to London and immediately been offered a few months in the United States to help launch Oliver on Broadway. By the time I got to New York, bribed by undreamed-of dollars, Beyond the Fringe was already an established success, and Peter and Wendy, his wife, with Judy Scott Fox, their faithful secretary, were living in what seemed to be a sumptuous ménage à trois in Greenwich Village. Here and there in the rambling apartment were real Tiffany lamps, only then returning to fashion, and there was an abundance of rich textiles of crimson and mulberry silk and crushed velvet, which created an atmosphere of opulence, or so it seemed to me, living as I did only a few blocks away in an austere cold-water flat above a poodle parlor. Peter and I, somewhat warily at first, began a friendship that was to last off and on until his death in 1995, if it is possible to speak of friendship with such a curiously inaccessible personage. Peter suggested that I collaborate with the New Zealand cartoonist Nicholas Garland on a comic strip for Private Eye. At the Eye's cluttered office in Greek Street pullulated the Cook Coterie, a fan club of real talent that included the editor Richard Ingrams, the writer John Wells, and the cartoonist and comedian Willie Rushton. One of my monologues on a record that I'd given Peter Cook in New York concerned a naive Australian Anglophobe in Earl's Court called Buster Thompson, whose life was a quest for cold Australian lager. This was the prototype of the Barry Mackenzie comic strip that ran off and on in Private Eye for the rest of the 60s. Cook furnished the name of the character, which derived from my own, Barry, and Nicholas Garland contributed the look. Barry Mackenzie took a while to catch on, but as the decade drew to a close, the adventures of Bazza had been banned in Australia and achieved cult status in Britain. In spite of sporadic appearances on talk shows through which he nonchalantly sauntered, Peter Cook, in his last years, devoted most of his time to golf and occasional inspirational visits to the offices of Private Eye. A good pianist will often know the show better than the artist himself, and there are still those who remember my offerings of the early 70s, in which sometimes, after a brief pause when I realized I'd lost my thread, I would turn to the extraordinary old lady at the keyboard, tourniqueted with feather boas, and hiss, "Where was I, Iris?" She always knew. Iris Mason was a natural star. I found her in Sydney in the early 70s when I was preparing a show, At Least You Can Say You've Seen It. Recently widowed, Iris was a classically trained pianist from New Zealand, who, at one stage, had studied with the great Percy Grainger. She was extremely small and obviously once pretty, but now in picturesque disarray, to which nicotine and alcohol had added their characteristic infections. Iris wore a wig, which she carelessly donned every morning like a hat. She applied her makeup with the same impatient bravura, slapping on a livid, Lautrec-like mask, and affixing her false eyelashes with little care to which belonged to upper or lower lid, sometimes with the unfortunate result that she would blink, and these long, mascara-clotted appendages would lock like Venus flytraps. When we first met, Iris regarded me with a look of profound suspicion, surpassed only by the scrutiny I received many years later from my future mother-in-law. However, we sang a few songs together around the keyboard of her Yamaha upright, and the ice melted. Iris, like Ronaldo Hahn and Hoagie Carmichael, liked to smoke as she played the piano, and she enjoyed a drink then as well. She would sail onto the stage extraordinarily bedizened, choked with ropes of pearls and gaudy feather boas, and on reaching the piano, she would commence to slowly remove the many rings from her delicate fingers, dropping them noisily into a receptacle beside the keyboard. She would then, with the same deliberation, reach for a large brandy ballon set on a small table beside the piano and pour into it about 3 inches of creme de menthe, topping up the drink with a sulphurous dash of advocat. Having stirred this stomach-churning cocktail, Iris took a long swig, sometimes emptying the glass to groans of revulsion from the audience. She then, with brilliant technical skill, played her introductory medley, culminating in a few bars of the national anthem. Was it a joke? Was it real? Should we or shouldn't we? A spotlight swung from Iris to the curtain at the opposite side of the stage, and Edna's pink, lurex-gloved wrist extended towards the audience, the fingers flexing imperiously upwards. The command was unequivocal, and as Iris played God Save the Queen, the audience stood. It was in Hong Kong that Iris enjoyed her greatest social success. In 1973, the Mandarin Hotel was considered one of the best hotels in the world. Peter Stafford was its gifted manager, and he bravely invited me to do a 2-week cabaret season in the hotel's nightclub, the Harbour Room. Les Patterson had just been invented, and having appointed him Australian cultural attaché to the Far East, I decided it best if he opened our Hong Kong show by coming through the audience to the stage and interrupting Iris's overture with a few drunken words about the colony, remarks that the new Puritanism of today would unquestionably deem racist. On the first night, dressed as Les and suitably upholstered, I hovered near the entrance to the nightclub, hearing with relief the laughter and applause that greeted Iris Mason's entrance. It was a very smart audience indeed of bankers, stockbrokers, and English executives from Swire and Jardine Matheson, stalwarts of the Hong Kong Club. That night, Iris was obliged to play her overture for much longer than she expected, for where was Sir Les? Shouldn't he have interrupted the music by now? But I was still outside the club remonstrating with the Chinese maitre d'. "You can't come here, you drunk!" "I'm the show, I am the show," I tried without success to interject. But by then he'd called for assistance. "You drunk! You drunk!" There was a scuffle, shouts, hoarse imprecations. Gradually, in the warmth of the harbour room, at linen-top tables and on plush banquettes, Englishmen in shirts by Mi Yi and Ascot Chang and fine lounge suits by Arman Hing Chong turned and beheld a fat, red-faced man in heavily stained powder-blue seersucker, holding a whiskey bottle and struggling with 2 formidable Oriental bouncers in black tie. It was only the intervention of a real diplomat, the manager, Peter Stafford, that finally permitted Sir Leslie Colin Patterson, none the worse for a little roughing up, to mount the stage at last to drunken cheers. The show was a hit.